Every ancient civilization has an origin, a migration you can trace, a founding myth you can point to, a trail of pottery and bone that leads backward to some earlier people, some earlier place. Except one. The Sumerians simply appear in the archaeological record fully formed, with cities, with laws, with writing, with irrigation canals and temples and kings. And to this day, after 2 centuries of digging, translating, and arguing, no one can agree on where they came from. This is not a fringe claim. This is one of the oldest unsolved problems in the history of civilization, and it has a name among scholars. They call it the Sumerian problem. To understand why this problem exists, you have to go back to southern Iraq, to the flat, sun-baked land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, a place the Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. Around 6,000 years ago, something extraordinary happened here. Small farming villages that had existed for centuries began to grow at a pace that has no real precedent before it. One of them, a settlement called Uruk, exploded in size until it became, by some estimates, the largest city on the planet. Tens of thousands of people lived inside its walls. It had monumental temples built on raised platforms. It had specialized labor, professional priests, standardized pottery produced on a scale that suggests organized workshops rather than individual households. And then, around 3400 BCE, the people of Uruk did something no human society had ever done before. They invented writing. At first it was simple. Pictures scratched into wet clay, tallies of grain, counts of sheep, records of who owed what to whom. But within a few centuries, those pictures evolved into something far more powerful, a wedge-shaped script we now call cuneiform, capable of recording not just numbers but language itself, sentences, stories, laws, prayers, the names of kings. This was the birth of history in the most literal sense, because history, as a discipline, begins the moment a society starts writing things down. Before Uruk, there is prehistory. After Uruk, there are records, and the people who created those records called themselves, in their own language, the black-headed people. We call them the Sumerians. Here is where the mystery begins. When archaeologists and linguists finally learned to read Sumerian in the 19th century, painstakingly working through thousands of clay tablets dug out of the mounds of southern Iraq, they made a discovery that should have been impossible. Sumerian did not belong to any known language family, not one. Every other ancient language we know of has relatives, cousins, a family tree you can draw. Ancient Egyptian belongs to the Afro-Asiatic family, alongside Arabic and Hebrew and Berber. Akkadian, the language that would later replace Sumerian as the everyday tongue of Mesopotamia, is a Semitic language, closely related to those same Afro-Asiatic tongues. Sanskrit belongs to the vast Indo-European family that stretches from India to Ireland. Chinese belongs to the Sino-Tibetan family. Even small, obscure languages spoken by a few thousand people in remote valleys usually have some traceable connection to their neighbors. Sumerian has none of this. It is what linguists call a language isolate, a language with no known relatives anywhere on Earth, living or dead. For nearly 200 years, some of the most brilliant minds in comparative linguistics have tried to connect it to something. They have proposed links to the Caucasian languages of the mountains between the Black Sea and the Caspian. They have proposed links to Dravidian languages spoken in southern India today. They have proposed links to Uralic languages like Finnish and Hungarian. They have proposed links to now extinct languages of the ancient Near East like Elamite and Hurrian. Every single one of these theories has been examined, tested, and ultimately rejected or left unproven by the wider community of linguists. The grammar does not match. The vocabulary does not match. The sound systems do not line up in any way that survives serious scrutiny. Sumerian sits alone in the family tree of human language, an island with no bridge to any other shore. Now, a language appearing without relatives is strange, but languages can and do go extinct without leaving descendants. And isolated languages exist in the modern world too, like Basque in the mountains of Spain and France, spoken by a people who seem to have lived in that region since before the arrival of Indo-European speakers. So, on its own, the language mystery might be explainable as an accident of history, a branch of some larger family that simply died out everywhere else. But the language problem does not stand alone. It sits inside a much larger puzzle because the archaeological record shows the same abrupt, unexplained appearance. Before the rise of Uruk, southern Mesopotamia was occupied by a culture archaeologists call the Ubaid culture, simple farming communities that had lived along the rivers for well over 1,000 years, growing wheat and barley, herding sheep and goats, building modest mud brick houses. There is no obvious archaeological signature showing a new population sweeping in from elsewhere and replacing them. The pottery styles show continuity. The settlement locations show continuity. And yet, within a handful of centuries, this quiet agricultural society transforms into something categorically different, A society with monumental architecture, a rigid social hierarchy, professional scribes, organized religion with a defined pantheon, and eventually the invention of writing itself. It is one of the fastest and most dramatic transformations in the archaeological record of the ancient world, and archaeologists still debate fiercely whether this was a purely internal development, a slow-burning transformation of the existing Ubaid population, or whether it involved the arrival of a new group of people who layered themselves on top of, or blended with, those who were already there. The ancient Sumerians themselves seem to sense that something about their origins was unusual. Their own mythology does not describe a heroic migration story the way so many other ancient peoples told of their ancestors crossing mountains or seas to reach their homeland. Instead, Sumerian creation. Myths describe humanity, and by extension the Sumerians themselves, as having been formed directly from the clay of the very land they lived on, molded by the gods at places like Eridu and Nippur, cities that Sumerian tradition regarded as the oldest in the world, cities said to have existed even before the great flood that appears in their oldest surviving epics, the same flood story that would later echo, with startling similarity, in the biblical account of Noah. In other words, the Sumerians told a story of themselves as literally indigenous, born from the soil of southern Iraq, with no memory, or at least no surviving account, of coming from anywhere else. For a long time, some of the earliest generations of Western scholars who first deciphered cuneiform found this hard to accept, largely because of assumptions rooted in 19th and early 20th century thinking. Many early Sumerologists assumed that a civilization this advanced, appearing in a region surrounded by simpler agricultural societies, must have arrived from somewhere else, carrying its sophistication with it, like a package delivered from a more advanced homeland. Various homelands were proposed over the decades. Some argued for an origin in the mountains of Iran, based on certain artistic motifs that seemed to echo highland traditions. Others pointed toward Central Asia, or even further east, toward the Indus Valley, noting some superficial similarities in artistic style, and the shared use of certain agricultural techniques and animals. A few speculated about links to India, an idea that gained enough traction that later genetic researchers specifically designed studies to test it. But as archaeological methods improved through the 20th century and as excavation techniques became more careful and more scientific, the evidence increasingly pointed the other way. Layer by layer, site by site, the material culture of southern Mesopotamia shows continuous, gradual development from the Ubaid period into the Uruk period, with no clear break, no sudden layer of foreign pottery, no evidence of violent conquest or mass replacement. This led many modern archaeologists to favor what is sometimes called the indigenous development model. The idea that the people who became the Sumerians, or at least the majority of the population, were the descendants of the same farming communities that had lived in the marshes and river valleys of southern Iraq for thousands of years before Uruk ever existed. On this view, the Sumerian civilization was not imported. It was grown locally out of centuries of agricultural surplus, population density, and the social pressures that come when too many people live too close together and need new ways to organize themselves, keep records, and resolve disputes. And yet the language problem refuses to go away. Because if the Sumerians truly were simply the descendants of the earlier Ubaid population with no outside contribution, you would expect the language to show at least some faint connection to something, some substrate influence from neighboring regions, some trace of contact. Instead, it remains stubbornly, uniquely alone. This is why the debate has never fully closed. Some scholars argue that Sumerian represents the last, surviving trace of a much older, broader family of languages that once covered a wider region of the ancient Near East, before being swept away entirely by the later arrival of Semitic-speaking peoples, leaving Sumerian as a solitary linguistic relic, the way certain isolated languages and mountain refugees are the last survivors of language families that vanished everywhere else. Others believe the Sumerians did descend from a distinct population, perhaps one that arrived earlier, and blended so thoroughly with existing groups that no clear archaeological signature was ever left behind. Only the fingerprint of a language that did not belong to its neighbors. It was precisely this unresolved question that eventually pushed researchers toward genetics, hoping that biology might succeed where archaeology and linguistics had stalled. The challenge, though, is a serious one, and it is worth being honest about it rather than glossing over it, because it shapes everything we currently know and do not know. Ancient DNA is notoriously difficult to recover from human remains in Mesopotamia. DNA degrades over time, and the rate of that degradation depends heavily on climate. Cold, dry environments like the permafrost of Siberia or the high altitudes of the Andes preserve genetic material remarkably well, sometimes for tens of thousands of years. Hot, humid environments do the opposite. In southern Iraq, with its marshes, its heat, and its long history of flooding along the Tigris and Euphrates, is about as unfavorable an environment for DNA preservation as you can find. As a result, no confirmed, published, peer-reviewed genome from a verified Sumerian individual currently exists in the scientific literature. This is an important point because a great deal of sensational content online claims otherwise, describing dramatic new genetic studies that supposedly prove the Sumerians were some kind of biologically unique or unclassifiable population unrelated to anyone alive today. Those claims are not supported by any published research. What has actually been studied carefully and rigorously is something a little different and in some ways just as interesting. Since no ancient Sumerian genome exists, researchers have instead looked at a population widely believed to be their closest cultural descendants, the Marsh Arabs of southern Iraq, known locally as the Medan. For centuries, the Marsh Arabs lived in the wetlands of the Tigris-Euphrates Delta in a way of life that, in some respects, echoed descriptions from ancient Sumerian texts. Building reed houses on artificial islands, herding water buffalo, and moving through the marshes by canoe in a landscape that has changed remarkably little over thousands of years. Because of this deep continuity of lifestyle and geography, many scholars have long considered the Marsh Arabs to be, culturally and possibly genetically, among the most direct living links to the ancient Sumerians. A landmark genetic study published in the early 2010s set out to test this connection directly. Researchers collected genetic samples from more than 140 Marsh Arab individuals and compared them against a large control group P of other Iraqi populations, examining both Y chromosome DNA, which is passed down from father to son, and mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down from mother to child. What they found did not support the old theories of a distant foreign origin at all. Instead, the genetic data revealed a population whose ancestry was overwhelmingly rooted in the Middle East itself, showing only weak and minor contributions from South Asia or Africa. In other words, the genetics pointed toward the same conclusion the archaeology had increasingly favored, that this population, and by extension the ancient Sumerians, if the connection holds, were most likely autochthonous, meaning native to the region, rather than recent arrivals from India, Central Asia, or anywhere else. The study did find something more subtle and more interesting buried within the Y chromosome data. A specific genetic lineage showed signs of a local population expansion that lines up chronologically, remarkably closely, with the era of the Sumerian city-states themselves, suggesting that whatever social and economic changes drove the rise of cities like Uruk may have also driven a corresponding expansion in the number of men carrying that particular paternal lineage, perhaps reflecting the advantages, in reproductive terms, of being part of a newly powerful ruling class or professional caste in a rapidly growing urban society. Alongside this, the researchers identified an older, rarer lineage that seemed to connect the population of southern Iraq to groups further north, in the direction of ancient northern Mesopotamia, hinting at even deeper connections and movements of people across the region long before the Sumerian period began. None of this points to a Sumerian population that fails to match any human group alive today. If anything, it points to something almost the opposite, a population deeply, continuously rooted in its own homeland, showing genetic continuity with the wider Middle East, rather than genetic isolation from it. So why does the language remain so strange if the people themselves seem to have been so thoroughly local? This is the heart of what makes the Sumerian problem genuinely fascinating rather than merely a matter of missing data. It suggests that language and genetics do not always move together in lockstep through history, a lesson that shows up again and again in other parts of the world once you start looking for it. Populations can retain deep genetic continuity in a landscape for thousands of years while completely changing the language they speak, adopting the tongue of conquerors, neighbors, or trading partners, sometimes within just a few generations. The reverse can also happen. A relatively small group of people can spread a language across a vast new population through conquest, trade, or prestige without contributing very much to the genetic makeup of the people who end up speaking it. Given this, it becomes entirely plausible that the population of southern Mesopotamia stayed largely the same, genetically, across the transition from the Ubaid period to the rise of Uruk, while the specific language known as Sumerian arrived, developed, or rose to dominance through some other mechanism entirely, perhaps spreading from a small but influential group, perhaps surviving from a much older linguistic layer that once covered a wider area before being overwritten almost everywhere else by later arrivals. There is another possibility that some linguists take seriously, the idea that Sumerian was never actually a single people's only language in the way we might assume, but was instead the language of a particular social or professional class, perhaps a religious or administrative elite centered around the temple institutions of early cities, while other languages, since lost entirely without ever being written down, were spoken by the broader population in daily life. Under this model, Sumerian would not represent the language of an entire ethnic group with a distinct origin at all, but rather the language of a certain institution, a legal and religious register that happened to be the one preserved for us because it was the one worth writing on clay. If this is true, then the search for the origin of the Sumerians, as an ethnic group, may be, in a sense, asking the wrong question, since the label Sumerian may describe a cultural and an administrative identity built around a shared writing system and shared temple religion, rather than a single bloodline with a clear point of origin somewhere on a map. What makes all of this so compelling is that it does not require exaggeration or fabrication to remain genuinely mysterious. The honest, evidence-based version of the Sumerian story is strange enough entirely on its own terms. A language with no relatives anywhere on the planet, spoken by the people who are credited with inventing writing itself, sitting in a landscape that shows deep, unbroken cultural continuity stretching back thousands of years before that writing appears. A people whose own myths describe them as having sprung directly from the soil, with no migration story of their own to tell, at exactly the same time that the archaeological record shows their cities growing to unprecedented size seemingly overnight, in historical terms. A genetic record, still frustratingly incomplete, that hints at deep local roots for their probable descendants, while leaving the deeper question of who first spoke the Sumerian language, and where that language ultimately came from, still genuinely open. This is a real historical mystery, sitting at the exact center of three different scientific disciplines, archaeology, linguistics, and genetics, each one telling a slightly different part of the story, and none of them, even now, quite managing to answer the question completely. There is also a broader historical pattern worth mentioning, because the era in which Uruk expanded outward across the region is itself remarkable, and adds another layer to the puzzle. Archaeologists refer to this outward spread as the Uruk expansion, a phenomenon in which pottery styles, architectural techniques, and administrative tools associated with southern Mesopotamian cities suddenly begin appearing at sites hundreds of miles away, from what is now southeastern Turkey to western Iran. For a long time, this was interpreted as evidence of colonization, as though Uruk itself was sending out settlers to found trading outposts across the wider region, spreading its culture the way later empires would spread their own. More recent scholarship has complicated this picture considerably, suggesting a more complex web of trade, imitation, and local adaptation, rather than a simple one-directional colonization from a single center. Even so, the sheer geographic reach of this cultural influence, radiating outward from a handful of cities in the space of a few centuries, only reinforces how unusual and how rapid the rise of Sumerian civilization truly was compared to almost everything that came before it in human history. It is also worth considering how the Sumerians themselves organized time and record-keeping, because this too hints at just how sophisticated this supposedly sudden civilization already was almost from the moment writing appears. Within a remarkably short span after the earliest pictographic tablets, Sumerian scribes were already producing detailed administrative archive. Tracking the distribution of rations, the movement of livestock, the output of temple workshops, and the boundaries of agricultural land. Later, scribal schools, known as edubas, trained generations of students in reading, writing, mathematics, and literature, producing an entire class of literate professionals whose exercises and copied texts have survived in extraordinary numbers, giving modern researchers an almost unprecedented window into the daily concerns of an ancient society. This is not the profile of a culture that stumbled into complexity by accident. It is the profile of a society that built, with startling speed, an entire infrastructure of literacy, education, and bureaucracy that many later civilizations would take centuries longer to develop on their own. It is worth pausing here to appreciate exactly what is at stake in this mystery, because the Sumerians are not some minor forgotten culture on the margins of history. They are, in a very real sense, the foundation beneath an enormous share of what we consider civilization itself, the concept of the city as a center of specialized labor and administration, the concept of written law embodied in the codes that would later influence figures like Hammurabi, the sexagesimal number system based on units of 60 that we still use today every single time we look at a clock and count 60 seconds in a minute, or 60 minutes in an hour, or divide a circle into 360 degrees. The concept of the wheel, first used in Mesopotamia for pottery before it was ever used for transportation. The earliest known epic poetry, most famously the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story so old that it already felt ancient to the Babylonians who copied and preserved it 1,000 years after it was first composed, and which contains, embedded within it, a flood narrative so similar to the biblical story of Noah that scholars have spent well over a century debating exactly how the two are connected. All of this traces back to a people whose fundamental origin story remains, to this day, unresolved. There is something almost fitting, even poetic, about the fact that the civilization credited with inventing the written record The very tool historians use to reconstruct the past is itself the civilization whose own past resists reconstruction most stubbornly. Every other major ancient people we study, the Egyptians, the Akkadians, the Hittites, the early Chinese dynasties, can eventually be placed somewhere on a family tree of migration, language, and genetics, even when the details remain debated and contested by specialists. The Sumerians sit apart from that pattern, a founding culture with a beginning that dissolves the moment you try to look directly at it, like trying to focus on something at the very edge of your vision that seems to vanish the instant you turn your attention fully toward it. Another piece of the puzzle that deserves attention is the Sumerian king list, an ancient document that records the names of rulers stretching back before the Great Flood. Mentioned in Sumerian mythology, attributing to those earliest kings reign lengths of tens of thousands of years, numbers clearly meant to be understood as legendary rather than literal. What is striking is how the list treats the flood as a genuine historical dividing line, separating a mythic age of impossibly long-lived kings from a more recognizable era of shorter, more plausible reigns afterward. Some archaeologists have connected this flood tradition to real evidence of significant flooding layers found at certain Mesopotamian sites, raising the possibility that a genuine catastrophic flood, even if far more localized than the mythology suggests, left such a deep impression on the collective memory of the region that it became woven permanently into how the Sumerians understood their own distant past. Whether or not that connection holds up, the king list shows a society already deeply concerned with constructing a coherent narrative of its own history, even while that narrative blurred the line between memory and myth, in exactly the way you would expect from a culture reaching back toward origins it could no longer fully recall or explain. It is also worth putting the Sumerian language isolate in context by comparing it briefly to other isolates that have survived into the modern era, because this comparison is genuinely illuminating, rather than simply a curious aside. Basque, spoken today in the Pyrenees between Spain and France, is generally believed to predate the arrival of Indo-European languages in Western Europe by thousands of years, surviving as a solitary linguistic holdout, surrounded on all sides by related Romance languages descended from Latin. Ainu, once spoken across northern Japan, appears similarly disconnected from the Japonic and other language families surrounding it. In both of these cases, genetic studies of the modern speakers of these isolate languages have generally shown considerable continuity with their geographic neighbors, reinforcing the same lesson that the Marsh Arab genetic data suggests for Mesopotamia, that a population can remain deeply rooted in a particular landscape for an extraordinarily long time, while its language follows its own separate, often untraceable history. Sumerian, in this light, may simply be the oldest and most consequential example of a pattern that shows up again and again wherever historical linguists and geneticists have looked closely enough to compare their evidence side by side. This does not mean the mystery will never be solved. Ancient DNA science has advanced at an astonishing pace over just the past 15 years, and techniques that once seemed impossible, extracting usable genetic material from petrous bone, the incredibly dense portion of the skull behind the ear that preserves DNA far better than other bones, even in warm and difficult climates, have already transformed our understanding of ancient migrations across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. It is entirely possible that a future excavation in southern Iraq, using these newer techniques on precisely the right burial from precisely the right period, could finally recover a genuine ancient Sumerian genome and give us a direct genetic snapshot of these people for the very first time, rather than relying on their probable modern descendants as an approximation. Advances in comparative linguistics, too, continue to refine and re-examine old theories about possible relatives for the Sumerian language, using computational methods that did not exist even a generation ago to hunt for patterns too subtle for the human eye alone to detect reliably across such vast stretches of time. Until that day comes, though, the Sumerians remain exactly what they have been for nearly 2 centuries since their language was first deciphered from broken tablets pulled out of the dust of Iraq, a civilization that gave the world its earliest writing, its earliest cities, its earliest law codes, its earliest epic literature, and yet somehow left behind no clear answer to the single most basic question you could ask about any people in history. Who were they, and where did they truly come from? Not a fabricated answer manufactured for a headline. A real, open question that has occupied serious scholars for generations, and one that, even today, with all our satellites and sequencers and supercomputers, we still cannot fully answer. Perhaps that unanswered question is precisely why the Sumerians continue to fascinate us more than 5,000 years after their cities first rose from the mud of the Tigris and Euphrates. They gave humanity the tools to record its own history, and in one of history's great ironies, their own beginning is the story those tools were never quite able to capture. Every clay tablet they left behind answers 100 small questions about their laws, their trade, their gods, and their daily lives, while the largest question of all, the question of where they themselves first came from, remains written nowhere, in any language, on any surface that has yet been found.